You might have heard about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos in the last few weeks for their rocket launches to the edge of space. Elon and Jeff go back and forth vying for who is the richest man in the world. Most recently, Elon is in the lead with just under $210 billion to his name. Now, both of these men are known for having given away millions of dollars at a time to various charities. And while their donations are commendable, I think it is clear that Jesus would point to the widow in our gospel today as the person who is being truly generous. She is being generous in the way that God is generous. In our gospel, we hear what sounds like a really bad idea. And this poor widow makes a donation to the treasury, and she put in everything she had, all she had to live on. That sounds like a very bad idea. Yet Jesus draws his disciples' attention to her as an example of generosity, and here we are almost 2,000 years later with her example being held up to us to inspire us to be generous. So let's consider this seemingly bad idea. First, she's a poor widow, which was quite typical of the widows of Jesus' day. Widows had no inheritance rights, so they had to rely on their children or wealthy relatives or the charity of those around them. So widows were vulnerable to say the least, but in the Old Testament scriptures, there were promises that God would protect them. And we saw one of these promises in our psalm today in the line that said, "The Lord upholds the orphan and the widow." And in our first reading, we saw a miraculous example of God providing food for the widow and her son through the prophet Elijah. Widows were taught to have faith in the Lord. They were taught to rely on the Lord for all their needs. So when this poor widow comes forth in our gospel today with her 2 coins, it would seem like a good idea for her to keep one of those coins, right? To give away the other, to give away 50% of all she had to live on, would still be an extraordinary, generous act. But she gives both coins away, all she had to live on. One commentator describes this as reckless generosity, a reckless generosity that parallels Jesus' own generosity. Jesus who gave himself completely, Jesus who didn't hold back anything for himself, but gave himself completely to us, gave his whole life for us on the cross. The widow is also a reflection of Jesus who trusted completely in his Father. Her generosity is a reflection of Jesus' own generosity. And as disciples, we want to be inspired by her example. We want to be generous, like really, really generous. We want to strive to reflect Jesus' generosity. Now, generosity is not simply about giving money. It may not be a good idea for you to go out and imitate the poor widow literally and give away everything you have to live on, but it is a good idea to give ourselves completely to Jesus as his disciples, offering our whole life to him, all that we are and all that we have. It's also a good idea to be inspired by the widow's generosity and to strive to grow in generosity as disciples. There's a practical spiritual stewardship principle called proportional giving. Proportional giving is a lens that we can use to look through. And this lens helps us to assess our own personal generosity. We see proportional giving highlighted by Jesus in the gospel today when he points out that the poor widow put in more than the rich. In other words, she had given more proportionally than the rich, because the rich had put in large sums, but they were contributing out of their abundance. It didn't really cost them all that much. It was a small portion of their wealth. Now let's take the example of the two billionaires that I mentioned at the beginning and how they have given away millions of dollars at a time. So for them to give a $200 million donation, which they do, right? I have a hard time thinking in those terms, but for them to give a $200 million donation when they have $200 billion, proportionally, that would be like having $1,000 and giving away $1, right? So it's still giving, but it's a very different kind of giving than the giving of Jesus on the cross or the poor widow in the temple. Their giving is a giving that doesn't cost all that much, giving from excess rather than giving from great generosity. The poor widow only gave a penny's worth, not much at all, but it's all she had, so proportionally, her generosity is so much greater. I've known many people over the years who have applied this practical stewardship principle of proportional giving to their Christmas giving. You know, at Christmas, everyone feels more generous. You know, charitable donations go way up and all that kind of thing. What some people have done is, instead of first making sure that all their gifts are taken care of, that they make sure that they buy the perfect presents, everything that everyone wants, and then giving to charity out of what's left over, they've decided to cut way back on their giving to one another gifts and use that money to give to the poor, and so increase their charitable donations. So through the lens of proportional giving, they were able to assess their generosity and to ensure that they were giving a greater proportion of their money to the poor versus to themselves and their Christmas gifts. Now, proportional giving also applies to two other areas of stewardship. It applies to our time and our talents, areas, again, that as disciples we want to be generous in. Giving of our time is primarily speaking about the time rendered unto God. So things like prayer and worship, it's time spent intentionally developing our spiritual life. So take, for example, someone who is, it's got a very demanding job, and they're raising a family, and they still find 5 or 10 minutes of quiet prayer every day. And compare that to someone who doesn't have anything on their schedule, right? Their day is totally free most every single day, and they spend 30 minutes in prayer. Through that proportional giving lens, we see that the first is actually being more generous with their time. We can also look at how generous we are in sharing our talents through the proportional giving lens. So again, for example, if you have someone who's extremely talented and finds it effortless to get a lot done, compared to someone who's not so talented and they have to put in enormous efforts to get the same amount done, well, proportionally, it's this second one that is being more generous in sharing their talents. Now, these are simple, maybe oversimplified, general kind of examples of proportional giving, but they're meant to help us to see a practical application of proportional giving to our generosity. Ultimately, our generosity is only known to us and God, really, right? And so only we and God can fully know to the degree of our generosity. But this proportional giving lens is a way for us to honestly assess our personal generosity. And we need also the help of the Holy Spirit, right? To invite the Holy Spirit, help me to see clearly my generosity. And help me to see ways that I could increase and grow in generosity as a disciple. Over the last 5 weeks, we've been speaking about the discipleship pathway and the 5 steps on that pathway. When we are intentional about taking our next steps, these steps move us deeper in our discipleship. And each step on the pathway is set up to animate the God-given gifts of every member of our parish, and the God-given gifts that every member of our parish brings to our community. And so again, we want to be generous in all 5 areas of our discipleship pathway. Now, some of these areas are probably easier for us than others. So we can use that proportional giving lens of our time and our talent to help us assess which area we might need to focus on, which area needs a little more work, or which area needs to be our next step to grow as a disciple and to grow in our generosity. So again, it might not be a good idea for you to go out and to literally imitate the widow and give away all that you have to live on, but it is a good idea to give yourself completely to Jesus as a disciple, offering him your whole life, all that you are and all that you have. It is also a good idea to be inspired by the widow's generosity and to strive to grow in generosity as disciples so that we can better reflect Jesus' own generosity, Jesus' self-sacrificing generosity. We want to reflect that to our world. And we want to make a significant difference with the little we have, just as the poor widow did.